Let us now understand how to determine number of use reducers in our project. If you remember, we created to-do list app and also we have created one project to display the date. So in this to-do list project, what we did, we created reducer for managing the task and also we created reducer for input field. And inside this display date, we had progress bar and also we had increment and decrement input field. But here we have only created one reducer. Inside this to-do list, we have created two reducers and accordingly we have managed the state. But inside this display date, we are having progress bar, we are having two input field for incrementing the counter as well as for decrementing the counter. But still, we have only created one reducer and inside one reducer function, we have managed entire state. So now the logical question is, why are we doing in this way? Why in one project we are using two reducers? Why in another project we are using one reducer? Or you can also ask why we don't need separate use reducer for each input field. Because in this display date, in total, we are having two input field and one progress bar. So all in all, I will be having three input field. So this is a logical as well as valid question to ask why for each input field we are not creating separate reducer, because inside this to-do list for managing the task we have created separate reducer as well as for adding the item inside the input field we have created separate reducer. Now one by one let us understand advantages and disadvantages of using single reducer and multiple reducers. So first, let us consider this project. Inside this, what we have done, we have used single reducer. Accordingly, we have passed single state object. And inside that, we have passed count property as well as we have passed step property. And both the properties we have passed inside our initial state. So here in this project, we are using only one reducer. So we are going to have one reducer function which will be managing this entire state update logic. So here both the properties count and step we are passing inside this initial state. And we have used only single reducer for this entire project. Why? Because here count and steps are related to each other. So if we create only one use reducer, then it will make our code cleaner as well as simple to understand. But for each and everything, if I start creating separate reducer, then it will be difficult to manage our entire state updating logic. And if you remember this project, our step is going to control how much count is incremented or decremented by. Based on the step, based on the progress bar value, we are incrementing or decrementing the counter. So here, both step and count are related to each other. Based on the change in the step, my count value will be either incremented as well as it is going to decrement its value. So definitely keeping them only in one reducer ensures consistency between these two values. So when we are using use reducer and if we are creating state by including all the variables which are related to each other, then it becomes very easy to maintain our code. Why? Because if we start creating separate use reducer for count and step, then we would have to handle cross state effects, which means if a step changes, we should think how it is going to affect our count. So that makes our simple code very difficult and also our entire simple logic will become very complex. So that is the reason in this project we have combined both count and step inside one single reducer, which will allow straightforward state management. So for this, I do not have to create complex logic and also I do not have to worry when my step changes, how it is going to affect my count, because we are updating all in one single reducer function. But now let us come to this to-do list project. Here, for managing the task and for input field, I have created two use reducers. So now, step by step, let us understand, is it necessary or is it not necessary? So first of all, it is not necessary to use separate use reducer hook for managing the task and input field. But in this project, I have shown you because when you're working in project, maybe at one point you need to use separate use reducer, then you should be having understanding of how to create multiple reducers. So again, you can take this as a challenge and you can combine both into a single reducer by structuring your state in more comprehensive way. So whenever you are creating the state in more precise way, you can define the state. Accordingly, you have to update the logic in your reducer. Okay, as I mentioned, it is not necessary, but still it is valid to separate use reducer hook when we are having completely independent pieces of state that are not directly related to each other. In our previous project, count and step were related to each other. In this project also, whatever data we are typing inside the input field, as soon as I click on the add button, the data has to be added in my list. Somewhere they are related to each other, but in most of the projects, our data will not be related to each other. So in that case, it is completely valid to use separate use reducer and accordingly manage their own state. But now in this project, why have we created separate reducers? So first answer I have given you because whenever you're working in project, you should have understanding of how to create separate reducer. And second is when we are having lot of input field, we can manage that input field inside one separate use reducer so that our code will be cleaner and also easily we can maintain our code. Just imagine if we are having multiple input field. So to manage all the input field, we have created one complete different reducer so that they will not be dependent on any other state and all the state updating logic will be present inside their own reducer function. That makes our code cleaner and also easy to maintain. But now let us understand some of the advantages and disadvantages of using multiple reducers in a project. So first advantage is separation of concern. So whenever we are using separate reducer, it is going to allow us to isolate different parts of a state, making our logic more modular. So in this project, for managing the task and for handling input field, we have created separate state which can help us organize our code more cleanly and more efficiently. Then, simplified reducer logic. So, by splitting these concerns, each reducer focuses on specific part of the logic. This results in simpler and more readable reducer function as they don't have to handle unrelated actions. Then we are having scalability. Just imagine your project is growing larger, and in that, if you are using only one use reducer, then you will mess up and you will not be able to get the proper result. Then, in that case, having separate reducers makes easier to manage changes and different updates. For example, if I want to add more input fields or additional task management features, then I don't have to deal with larger reducer. Instead, what I have done, I have created separate reducer for both and accordingly both will be managing their own actions inside the reducer. Then, most important, improved debugging. As I mentioned, if our project grows larger, then it will be very difficult to handle one reducer. But now, since each reducer is going to handle its own slice of state, then debugging becomes straightforward because if any issue arises with input handling field, then we can only focus on that relevant reducer rather than shifting through entire logic that also manages the task. So it is going to improve the debugging as well. One more important advantage, it is going to reduce unnecessary re-renders. Why? Because whenever we are updating our input field, it is not going to trigger re-render for task or vice versa. So it is simply going to prevent unnecessary re-renders. Then finally, clarity in actions. So whenever we are separating reducers, each reducer will be having clear set of action types specific to their domain. For managing the task, I will be having different action. For managing the input field, I will be having different action. So for each and everything, our reducer will be having different set of action for that specific domain. And also, it is going to provide flexibility for future refactoring. What we can do in more easy way, we can migrate one part of the state to different component or context without touching the entire state logic. So migration is possible whenever we are separating entire logic. But as already said, when there are advantages, there are also disadvantages. So let us now focus on disadvantages of using separate use reducer. First is overhead of multiple use reducers. So if you're working in larger and complex project, in that case, it is completely valid to use different reducer for which states are not dependent on each other. But if you are maintaining separate reducer for simple project, then you are going to increase the complexity and also you have to write more complex code. So in simple project, you can easily go with single reducer and accordingly you can update the entire logic, as well as for simple complex project, if you start using multiple reducer for each and every input field, then it is just going to increase our boilerplate, because we already know use reducer setup comes with its own boilerplate. We are going to have initial state, we will have action types, we are going to have reducer function, we are going to have dispatch function. So how many use reducers you are going to use? That many times you have to use all this concept to implement your code. So for simpler project, do not increase the boilerplate. If you're having one or two state updates, then you can directly go with use state. You do not have to look inside this use reducer hook. And third is communication between reducers. So if our input state and task state need to interact, for example, whenever we are adding tasks based on the input value, then managing communication between separate reducers could be slightly more complicated compared to having only one reducer. So here in this project, we have done the same thing. So that is the reason inside both the reducer, we have to add separate logic for updating the state. So in this project, we have done the same thing. Whatever value we are entering inside the input field, as soon as you click on add button, the value has to be added inside the input field. So here in this project, we are communicating between reducers. So that is the reason we had more boilerplate in our code. So in conclusion, you have to separate reducers only when different parts of the states are independent to each other. If they are dependent on each other, then only one reducer is fine, and accordingly, you can get the same result without increasing any boilerplate. Again, it comes to personal preference, how you want to structure the code and how you want to manage the state. But as a beginner, if you want to completely understand about this use reducer, for simple project also, you can try to convert into use reducer, so that when you go into complex project, then it should be like a cake on a plate. You should not feel any complexity and you should be ready to tackle any situation.